All right, so we'll push on then with the next part of the conversation. So the next thing I wanted to focus on was a particular project that I've been involved with and which I draw on basically as my data set for this, and that's the Jesus database. So this was first published in Dom Crossan's Historical Jesus book, 1991. It's one of the appendices at the back of his book, and Dom gave me permission sort of 10, 12 years ago to take that, turn it into an online thing and just start annotating it and working with it. So it's now turned into basically an annotated online resource which is looking at all the historical Jesus material prior to about 300, no matter where it comes from. Okay? And the reason for the 300 is that once you get into the beginning of the 4th century, you're getting close to Constantine, everything changes once the government embraces Christianity. Totally different ballgame. So we're really looking for the earliest material that predates the kind of the peace deal between the Roman Empire and the Jesus people. Okay? Now there are 522 items in the inventory, but that means more than 1,500 individual episodes of pieces, because obviously some of those 522 items have multiple witnesses, multiple instances. Okay? So for instance, 120 is the Lord's Prayer, and we have 3 ancient versions of the Lord's Prayer. Okay, Matthew 6, Luke 11, and the chapter in the Didache. So there you've got 3 ancient sources, but Matthew and Luke are not seen as independent of each other, whereas in the case of the Didache, it could be an independent tradition. So we've got more than 1,500 examples of sayings and other items, episodes, etc. Of those, 340 odd are things with a single witness, and that's problematic. If there's only a single witness for a particular saying or particular parable, particular event, then our evidence is much weaker historically. Okay. There are 176 separate events which exist in 387 reports and so on. So that, you can cut the data in various ways. And when we say witness, what we mean there is an early text. So, like say the Didache, Gospel of John, the Synoptic tradition, etc. Texts that could be seen as independent witnesses. So you're looking for, this goes to the criterion of multiple attestation. Okay? And multiple attestation both in terms of independent sources, but also multiple attestation in terms of genre. So if the same basic idea is found in a parable, but also in an aphorism and also in a story, then that idea, that theme or whatever, has multiple attestation of genre, as distinct from multiple attestation of witnesses. Okay, and so the Jesus Database project it's a project about paying attention to the details, and actually, as I mentioned before, noticing that despite a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the hostile press releases and so on, at one level, when it comes to episode by episode, parable by parable, miracle by miracle, there's actually not a lot of daylight between the voting decisions of the Jesus Seminar and the individual decisions made by Raymond Brown, John P. Meyer, Ed Sanders, etc. Okay. Now, one of the things the seminar did which really upset those particular people is that when they brought out the Acts of Jesus, which was like the second volume of the major reports, instead of just reporting on the Jesus Seminar voting, they also said, and by the way, this is what Raymond Brown thinks on page such and such of that book, and it's the same. So had he been a member of the seminar, he obviously would have been voting grey or black or pink. And it really ticked them off because we were sort of co-opting their published work to integrate their published opinions into the decisions of the Jesus Seminar. And actually show that we're all playing the same game here. I mean, the people sitting around the table are the PhD students of those people. Okay, and the colleagues and so on of those people. We're not speaking different language. So just in one representation of the database is that. Now, one of the things I find interesting is that Single attestation becomes more characteristic the later the tradition. Makes sense when you stop and think about it. Multiple attestation is more likely to occur for items that are earlier, because over time there'll be more instances of that item being referred to or mentioned. Okay. Now clearly in the ideal world, items that are from the first 30 or 40 years after Jesus and have multiple attestation across independent sources and various types of genre, that's the best kind of evidence. That's the strongest kind of evidence. Material which only exists in the middle of the 2nd century and which only exists in one document, for example, the Good Samaritan, okay, is on very weak grounds when it comes to being attributed to Jesus. Or the prodigal son, okay, or the Annunciation to Zechariah and Elizabeth and to Mary and so on. These are traditions which only appear in the literature for the first time in the Gospel of Luke, and if you date the Gospel of Luke to the middle of the 2nd century, then these are very late traditions that only have one witness in support of them. Okay? Doesn't mean they're not theologically important, it just means historically they're on weak ground. So I've played with that data in a number of ways, and in particular a couple of the chapters in the book I quite explicitly deal with the Jesus database, but I also draw on the Jesus database quite a lot just for it's become a core tool for my work, and in many ways it's the project I will never finish. I mean, I'll just keep chipping away at this until I can't reach over the walking frame to get to the keyboard. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about core assumptions, because and the reason for the graphic is that, you know, depending on the map we leave port with and the tools, instruments we have, the compasses and other things, okay, the journey can be quite different. And the journey may or not reflect with what's actually out there. And that, of course, was very much an issue in the 18th and 19th century, particularly the 17th and 18th centuries, as European explorers with pretty inadequate maps set out to sail around the world in tiny little boats using compasses and various other tools, and discovered, of course, that actually the maps were inaccurate. Okay, so what's our map? Doesn't mean we'll stick with the map by the end of the day, but what's the map we're using? What are the instruments we're using as we get into this? So this is the kind of a discussion of some of the core assumptions. And some of them are blazingly obvious. Some of them we've probably already covered in some ways already. So assumption number one, this is page 14 and 15 in the book. Assumption number one, the Bible is a sacred text for millions of people. In fact, something like 30-40% of the world's population are Christians. So this is, you know, sacred text for all of those people. And in the case of the Old Testament, for Jewish people, and in a secondary sense for Muslims as well. So, you know, an awful lot of the world's population has a big investment in these texts. And that's something that I want to recognise. It's even a cultural icon for people who don't bother to read it, don't bother to go to church, you know, the whole swear an oath on the Bible, you know, all this sort of stuff. You know, it's like, and even it's the Bible. You know, this is like the final word. There's nothing more to be said. So we're dealing with material which is of immense significance to a large percentage of the world's population. And we're probably just fortunate that, unlike Muslims, most Christians are not going to issue a fatwa and, you know, try and kill an author of a controversial theological volume. So there's a degree of academic trespass, because an academic is actually asking questions that the faithful don't want to hear. And it's, while there's a connection between academic scholarship and faith, they are different. It's a different kind of exercise. And so I'm conscious of a degree of academic trespass when I begin to pursue kind of more critical historical questions, or use a different metaphor, that like Moses at the burning bush, you know, we're on holy ground. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a need for some humility, there's a need for sensitivity, and we don't want to just, you know, totally ignore the impact, the immediate deconstructive, destabilising impact of critical scholarship on people of faith. That doesn't mean we don't go there, but it means we go there conscious of the risks. Okay? Because the alternative is, let's go back to the Middle Ages and the monks will tell us what to do. The bishops will tell us how to think. And we'll have the bubonic plague and all sorts of other wonderful things. So assumption number 2 is to then say, but on the other hand, the Bible is an ancient text, as a written document, or as a collection of written documents. The Bible is itself a text whose historical origins, preservation, transmission, and interpretation are properly subject to critical examination. Okay? That is not a value which would be accepted with respect to the Quran within Muslim circles. Okay? A Muslim would not easily accept a similar statement about the Quran. Okay? And many Christians have difficulty with that. But that's one of my assumptions. Therefore, I will treat the Bible no differently as best I can. I mean, obviously I approach the Bible, I know the Bible inside out. It's provided me with a lexicon of faith and so on. So, clearly I will naturally move and compare things and notice things within the biblical canon that I won't notice in other ancient documents because I don't know them as well. Okay, so it's not like I'm totally dispassionate here, but as best I can, I'll treat the Bible no differently than I would treat any other ancient document.
So what you're saying here is that there's such a thing as involuntary privileging.
All right. Is that what I'm saying? Yeah, I guess I'm saying that. I'm saying, and I can try and be aware of it, my best academic instincts are not to privilege the Bible in any sense. But I'm also somebody who's chosen to spend my life as a Bible scholar. Okay, I'm not a maths teacher. I'm not a teacher of classics. Yeah, I mean, I've devoted my life to this set of texts. But, so how do we do that? And so this partly comes back to the question that if there are miracles and other things that are described or included in the narratives of the Bible, I won't treat them any differently than I would treat similar stories in a non-Christian or non-biblical text. Okay? Jesus was an actual historical person. That's actually controversial among some of my friends. Okay? You think I'm terribly conservative at this point. All right. But I'm not one of the Christ myth people. And that's a serious academic issue to be explored, but I'm convinced that there's enough historical reasons to think that Jesus actually was a real human being and not simply a character out of a literary text. I would not make that assumption about Moses, and I'd have trouble making that assumption about David, and I certainly wouldn't make that assumption about Solomon. Okay? It's not just because a man with 300 wives and 700 concubines has a libido beyond any capacity I can imagine. Okay?
Apart from all the infighting in his hair.
Apart from the politics, a person with a motel that big, packed full of women, there is absolutely no historical archaeological evidence for such an amazing complex of women's quarters in Iron Age Jerusalem. I mean, it could not be eradicated. So that's what I mean. So on balance, I have no trouble affirming the historicity of Jesus as a real person. That doesn't mean I know what he was like, but that like Julius Caesar, he existed. Okay? Whereas Mithras didn't. Solomon probably didn't. Moses probably didn't. Okay? So some of those will be more controversial than others. So assumption number 4 is that he was Jewish. In fact, he was a Galilean Jew during the time of the Herodian succession, during the reign of Herod Antipas, and that he was possibly born during the final years of the reign of Herod the Great, which means earlier than 4 BC. That's probably the least significant datum on that page. That the Jewishness of Jesus and him as a Galilean Jew in the time of Herod Antipas. Okay? Makes no difference to me whether Jesus was born in 5 BC or 5 AD. Okay? But probably to be understood as having been born prior to the death of Herod the Great. Assumption number 5, So it's an operating assumption. I'm assuming Jesus was a disciple of and a successor to John the Baptist. Okay, and there are various reasons for that, including the criterion of embarrassment. This is not the kind of tradition someone's going to invent, because it actually puts Jesus in a secondary position relative to John. Because in the Gospels, John goes to great pains to make sure everybody understands Jesus is far more important to him. Well, he would say that in the Gospels, because the Gospels are not written by the followers of John the Baptist. Okay? So that's the kind of historical skepticism, hermeneutics of suspicion, if you like, that will come into play. Assumption number 6 is that Jesus' public activity was characterized by, firstly, being itinerant. Jesus appears not to have been somebody who was based in one location and everybody came to him. Now, that makes him different from some of the parallel figures that Giza Vermesh outlined years ago in his book Jesus the Jew. And you look at Oni the Circle Drawer and various other Jewish Galilean holy men, charismatic holy men. They basically lived in their village or their cave and people came to them. That's not the Jesus model. He's moving around a patch. Now, not for very long, because the other element in all this is it's a very short program. Unlike the Buddha, he didn't have 40 years to think about what he was saying and tweak a few things here and there. Okay? It's a very brief thing, but one of the characteristics is that his ministry is itinerant. And in particular, it's not based in Nazareth. Nazareth is not where Jesus does his stuff. And it's a program that involved healing, teaching, and ritualizing expressions of community through meals that transgressed the conventional purity codes of his time. So he was the sort of person who was going to offend. He was breaking some of the cultural assumptions of his peers.
CV of a prophet then.
And in a sense, this is typical prophetic kind of stuff. When prophets who are not on the payroll, okay, and who tailor their prophecy to the patron's requirements, are people that are more likely to be described this way. Yeah. And their end will come sooner and be more violent. Yeah?
Oh, sorry, no, I was just thinking out loud.
Thinking out loud. Okay. Finally happened. Good. Assumption number 7. The duration of Jesus' public ministry was probably quite short. Even in the traditional way of looking at it, it's only 3 years. But there's actually no reason for saying 3 years. That grows out of the fact that John's Gospel mentions the Passover at 3 different points in the story. Okay? Chapter 2, chapter 6, chapter 13. And we assume that their Passovers in different calendar years. And that they're successive calendar years. Okay? In other words, there's a naive acceptance of this narrative as literally and chronologically correct. But the data is open to other interpretations. Okay? So, probably quite short, the exact length unknown. For instance, we actually do not know how old Jesus was when he was crucified. We probably think he was 33 because that's what they told us in Sunday school. What if he was 55?
Too old.
What, too old to die?
No, too old to be alive, wasn't it? I mean, he could have been particularly healthy.
Sure, okay, well then you're importing social science data which says, well, the normal human demographics, mortality rates, it would be unusual for a non-elite person to live beyond 30 or 40 years of age. And so if Jesus is living on into his 6th decade, then that would challenge some of our assumptions about his social location.
But it would have made it easier for him to meet Paul on the road to Damascus.
How so? How would this help him?
Still around.
Still around? Oh, no. I mean, I'm talking about him being dead at the crucifixion. Okay. So there are all these kind of issues. So probably we're dealing with a fairly brief public activity characterized by, say, itinerancy and certain prophetic actions of healing, and the actions themselves, whether it's the healing and the different kinds of healing, the blind, the lame, the crippled, these are fulfilling messianic or addressing messianic categories from Isaiah and other places. So these are not just casual, oh, by the way, Jesus healed a blind man and a leper and a cripple. It's like Jesus is ticking off a list of the things that the prophetic paradigm would suggest. So it all, to me, it all coheres around Jesus as prophet rather than any other social role. Assumption number 8, this thing called the kingdom of God was central to Jesus' activity and distinctive of his activity. It's actually not a phrase we ever find in the Old Testament. Now, the idea that Yahweh is king is found in the Psalms and in various other bits of the Old Testament, but the concept kingdom of God, does not exist in the Old Testament. It begins to crop up in the Second Temple literature, but it's particularly characteristic and distinctively so for the Jesus tradition. So Jesus was onto this thing called God's empire, the empire of God. And of course that's in the context of the empire of Rome, where the emperor was God. So there's a social, historical context going on here. So we don't actually know exactly what that term meant to Jesus, and my hunch is that Jesus himself couldn't tell us, except by telling us a story or inviting us to have a piece of bread. That was his way of answering the question. I don't think he had it worked out. He was too early in the discernment process to have all the answers. And they crucified him before the ordination. Okay. So we've got an incomplete, it's meant to be disruptive and destabilising. Okay. So we have an incomplete data set. And that, I think, is part of the fundamental realities of doing historical Jesus research. We will never know what Jesus was like because we will never have all the information. Okay? And even if we had all the information from his 1 or 2 or 3 years of public activity, even then it's only a very brief period in Jesus' life, and I suspect he didn't have it worked out either. That, of course, goes to our model of, so what kind of an incarnation of the eternal God do we have in this person, Jesus of Nazareth? Now, my understanding of Jesus is that he could have no idea of who he was if he was to be fully human. Okay? Anybody who walks around, I'm really God in human form, is actually looking for a sanitarium, a nice lie down in a Bex. Okay? They're not the sort of people who turn other people's worlds upside down and create this amazing thing. So the humanity of Jesus, for me, is one of the things we won't be able to lose sight of. So I suspect Jesus himself was discovering what the kingdom of God meant. Okay? And one of the lessons was the crucifixion. So this kingdom movement, perhaps initiated by John and then further elaborated by Jesus, but not fully worked out, eventually resulted in both of them being executed as disruptive nuisances who were making life difficult for those in charge. So there's something about the fate that both John and Jesus experienced that I think is a really important factor we have to account for. In the case of Jesus, assumption number 10, that he was crucified by the Roman imperial authorities in Judea around the year 30 of the Common Era. And I think it was the 2nd of April in the year 30. Okay? Because that's my master's thesis on the dating of the Last Supper and so on. But, and it's either got to be 26 or 30 or 33. It's one of those, it's Passover in one of those 3 years. And of the 3, it's like, the 3 bears or Goldilocks or the 3 little pigs. The first one's too cold, the last one's too hot, whatever. The one in the middle is just right in this case. Assumption number 11 is that the death of Jesus was not actually the end of Jesus. It didn't stop as anticipated. And one of the points which someone like Paula Fredrickson, a Jewish New Testament scholar, points out is that it's interesting, the authorities didn't try and round up all the Jesus people. They didn't try and round up all the John people. They just took out John. They took out Jesus, and they figured that would be the end of it. Okay, so this was not seen as a movement where the adherents were so recalcitrant they had to be rounded up and sent off to a slave camp or something. From the authorities' perspective, there was no campaign to round up the disciples. It was just a case of get rid of the troublemaker, and then the rest will disappear. Well, guess what? They didn't. So something bigger than Jesus had been created. Okay, now that bigger than Jesus is what resurrection is about. It's what Pentecost is about. It's what the early Christian church is about. What is this bigger than Jesus? Okay. So after his death, the followers of Jesus invested their hopes for the future in their belief that his death was the case of an innocent victim being persecuted and killed by the powers that be. And there's a whole body of Jewish literature around that theme from the time of Jesus. They clearly, because we see it in the letters of Paul from as early as the 50s, they came to believe within 15 or 20 years, if not straight away, that Jesus had in fact already been raised from dead by the power of God and was upstairs, waiting to come back soon. Okay? And this becomes part of the defining hallmarks of early Christianity. And that he would soon return in triumph to demonstrate his vindication by God, to punish those who had killed him, and to implement the Messianic era. Now, of course, after 2,000 years, there's a big problem there. But we can understand how that would be a powerful mindset in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s of the first century. And how the destruction of Jerusalem would play into that as well. Well, that's one ticked off. He has wreaked his vengeance on the city that killed him. Okay. Now, we tend not to read. We have another story now, which shapes the way we think about Jesus at Easter and so on. But in the first decades after Easter, there were no Gospels to read. Okay? And so we find Paul talking about resurrection in various ways. Okay? And I deal with that material in chapter 10 in the book. Assumption number 12. The New Testament Gospels were, of course, composed by people who shared that kind of view of things. They believed in Jesus and they believed in the resurrection / vindication of Jesus. So that shapes their way of telling the story, but critical readings of the Gospels are able to distinguish layers in the storytelling. And that's what, whether it's Stanton or Barton or whether it's the Jesus Seminar or whatever, this is when people start to distinguish between sort of things Jesus might have said and done, what we find in the Gospels, why it's being said that way, and then what's happened in between. How do we get from what Jesus said and did through 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years to Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, so on, being written. So some of those layers may preserve authentic historical memories of the actions and words of Jesus, and some of them will also have peripheral information which are not really what the gospel was wanting to communicate, but in the process of communicating something else, they've actually preserved a nugget. Now, an example of that would be that passage in John, I think it's John chapter 6, where the scene, the big picture is that the Gospel of John is describing the conflict between Jesus and the Jews. And notice it's Jesus and the Jews. Like, hang on, Jesus isn't Jewish? Okay, but in John's Gospel, almost without exception, the opponents of Jesus are the Jews, which of course is reflecting the context of the people writing the Gospel of John, for whom the Jewishness of Jesus is kind of now invisible, but the opponents of Jesus, our opponents, they're Jewish. So you tell the story that way. But in telling the story of this conflict between Jesus and his contemporaries, John actually has the contemporaries say a couple of really interesting things. In chapter 7, well, this guy can't be from Bethlehem. So this guy can't be the Messiah. We all know the Messiah has to come from Bethlehem. Dong. Okay. So in the Johannine tradition, Jesus does not come from Bethlehem. Okay. Secondly, in chapter 6, it actually, as I've mentioned already, it says, hang on, who does this guy think he is? We know this guy. He's the son of Joseph, and we know his mother. Okay. Who, interestingly, is not named in John, just we know his mother, but his father is named. He's the son of Joseph. Okay. So little historical nuggets that have been preserved almost in passing while we paint this lovely scene, or this horrible scene, of conflict between Jesus and the Jews. Okay, that's the kind of drama that's going on. Assumption number 13, we're almost there. Assumption number 13 is that, as I talked about earlier in some of the other discussion, critical research will never succeed in capturing what the historical Jesus was actually like. I mean, yeah, it's hard enough to describe who we are now without trying to capture the details and the essence of somebody from 2,000 years ago. So we should have modest, realistic expectations of what historical Jesus can do, and of how much historical information about Jesus one might derive from the Synoptic Gospels, given the context of this class. Okay? However, reading the Gospels in that way, with an interest in the historical Jesus, can generate insights about Jesus, and can generate insights about Christianity, which will challenge the traditional ways that we imagine Jesus and the traditional ways that we practice Christianity. Now, a person who I think draws that out really beautifully is Elizabeth Johnson, who's a Roman Catholic religious, biblical scholar, and she talks about, in a lovely article, a book chapter, she talks about the relevance of historical Jesus research for Christian faith. And as she puts it, and I quote her a number of times in the book because I think her work's really good, she talks about refreshing the memory image of Jesus in the church. It's almost like you've hit the refresh button and you go back and you say, well, what was he really like? Not that we will answer that in every detail, but was he really like that? And so she says, like, a church that takes the Jewishness of Jesus seriously can never persecute the Jews. Okay? A church that really pays attention to what Jesus is on about during his ministry has to be a church that cares about the poor and that cares about life rather than life after death, and so on. So, there are implications. So while we will never get Jesus in a box because of our historical Jesus research, we can certainly get a better fit with who Jesus was, what he was like, and the dynamics between what Jesus appears to have been like and the way we've been talking about him and the things we've been doing in his name. And are they consistent? Is there congruence between the Jesus we find in the Gospels and the Jesus we hear about in church? Okay. To bring it right down to contemporary Australian political and church stuff, the Jesus of the Gospels, who says, let the little ones come to me, do not hinder the children, and so on. Would he have been a party to decisions made about arguing against claims by victims of sexual abuse? Would he have been summoned to the Royal Commission to explain his church's actions, as somebody else was last week? Okay. And a church that really embodied the spirit of Jesus would probably be a church that no insurer would want to take on. Okay? Because we'd be too great a risk. We'd just speak the truth and admit liability and apologise, and we wouldn't be trying to protect our interests. Okay? The Christ who goes to the cross is not a Christ who listens to advice from his lawyers and his insurer. So there's a challenge between the gospel tradition and the legacy of incorporated, structured institutional religion. How do we address that fit? And this, of course, can be disturbing for individuals and institutions, but it also offers opportunities for renewal and reformation. And indeed, one of the if we look at some of the great moments of reformation in the history of the Western Christianity, it's been when Paul has been rediscovered, including Augustine, including Martin Luther, including maybe Karl Barth. Imagine the Reformation if we actually rediscovered Jesus, started taking Jesus seriously in the life of the church. But of course, things might have to change. So, assumption number 14. This is clearly a person with an agenda. The future of the Jesus tradition will be shaped to a considerable degree by its capacity to transform itself from an exclusive religion, if you like a tribal religion, that just lives in one part of the planet, to an inclusive spiritual movement that engages with the best insights of human knowledge and the wisdom of other religious communities. Okay? Now there's enough for a centered motion for starters. Okay, so get straight on to somebody. But yeah, so that's one of my assumptions, that what I'm interested in, this is, so if you like, assumptions 1 and 2 are about, you know, the Bible and the sacred dimensions of what we're messing with. Assumptions 3 through 13, or even 3 through 12, if more focused on historical Jesus. The last 3 assumptions, 13, 14, 15, are more about the implications of historical Jesus research for the future of faith, the future of my faith, the future of my church, the future of Christianity. Okay. So one of my working assumptions as a sort of progressive Christian is that Christianity has to move beyond exclusivism and mortgaging truth to the uniqueness of Christ. Okay? And we've just got to grow up and recognise that God has bigger and other things to do in the world besides Christianity. And so how do we make sense of that? How do we plug our incredibly valuable religious, spiritual tradition around Jesus? How do we plug that into the rest of humanity and our understanding of the universe? Because I'm not interested in living in 12th century England. Assumption number 15 is that my ultimate goal when engaging in historical Jesus research is not actually to capture historical accurate information about Jesus in the first century, much as I want as much of that as I can get. Okay, that stuff really interests me and engages me. What I'm looking to do is to get spiritual wisdom that will inform the way I choose to live my life now. Okay? And the phrase that I picked up a couple of years ago now from the previous Archbishop of Canterbury was his phrase, shaping lives that are holy and true. And to me that's when I'm working in a parish, that's what I'm trying to do. When I'm teaching in a theological college, that's what I'm trying to do. How do I help people shape lives that are holy and true? If we could just do that, I'd retire a happy man. So yes, I want the best possible knowledge about the past, but I'm actually much more interested in the wisdom I need to live authentically now. Okay? So in the end, it comes back to subjectivity again. But hopefully it's disciplined subjectivity, which is accountable to some extent to what we think we know about the past when trying to imagine the best way to proceed into the future. Okay, so that's it in terms of that session.